So if you could just be coming in and taking your seats, I'd like to welcome you to the big debate. Thank you very much for coming back after tea. That's always a very nice moment for a facilitator when people actually come back to the plenary. I hope you had some excellent sessions. I've already had some very good feedback. So what we're going to do now is we're going to try and pull apart some of these challenging questions about the SDGs and how we're going to achieve them. And we've assembled for you a panel of, as I say, actually not very shy and retiring people at all, people who have strong opinions around this area. The way this will work is that the main speakers will each have a 7-minute intervention, and then their colleagues will have a secondary intervention on a related topic for about 3 minutes. We'll have a bit of discussion between the panelists, and then we'll have about half an hour where we'll open the floor for you to address questions to the panelists. So while you're listening to them, get your critical thinking caps on. Imagine that you're really trying to solve problems in your home country and think about whether what's being said on the panel is actually a reflection of your own situation or not, or right or wrong or useful. So on the panel, we have Dr. Stuart Bunn from the Australian Rivers Institute at Griffith University here in Brisbane, Professor Duncan from the University of Leeds, Ian, it's a very random order, sorry about that. Louise Whiting from WaterAid, and Ian Ross from Oxford Policy Management. Their profiles are on the app, so I'm not going to go into great length about their illustrious careers because you can look them up. And incidentally, while I'm about it, could you please, if you're on the app, make sure that you've made your profiles available to your colleagues so people can find them. You have to go into the settings to do that so people can find you. So the subject of our discussion is the SDGs. Are the SDGs an opportunity to push for a step change in the way we think about water services and wash services, or are they just an unachievable challenge? And somewhat on the pessimistic side of the question, unaccountably and not, this wasn't something we planned, we have two British people being pessimistic. Who knew? And over here, we have a couple of Australians being, hyper-optimistic, so I'm not quite sure what's going on there. Anyway, once again, I'd just like to say, go Britain and let these Australians win. It's not good. Okay, so first of all, I'm going to ask Duncan to talk a little bit about the targets and whether you think these are achievable. What does it actually mean when we think about this in the context of what we've done before and what we would have to do to achieve the SDG targets? You are going to have to pick up the microphone, Duncan. I think so. That sounds like it's on, actually. Yeah, there we go.
Okay, good afternoon. I think the answer to Barbara's question is both, really. If we very quickly look at water, the world as a whole met the MDG target for water in 2010. And as of mid-last year, there were 663 million people without improved water supplies. We've got an extra billion people coming along between now and 2030. So we're talking about nearly 1.7 billion people. I think the world can do that for water. Sanitation is rather more difficult. Last year, there were 2.4 billion people without improved sanitation. Add the 1 billion population growth, that's 3.4 billion people to be provided with actually now safely managed sanitation. And that works out at roughly 600,000 people per day between the beginning of this year and the end of 2030. Between 1990 and last year, the world managed 200,000 people per day with improved sanitation. So it's a step change to go from 200,000 to 600,000 people per day, and I leave it to you to decide whether that's feasible. It's certainly desirable, of course, but is it feasible? Safely managed sanitation. So we now have to talk about wastewater treatment, fecal sludge management, including treatment. In 2010, there were 1.5 billion people who had sewers, served by sewers, but who had no treatment. And nobody knows the real figure, but it's somewhere between 1.5 and 2 billion people without adequate fecal sludge management from their on-site systems. So that's a huge task to get those people to be safely managed. Open defecation is a huge challenge in its own right, and it's part of SDG target 6.2, to end open defecation by 2030. In the middle of last year, there were just under 1 billion people who were open defecators, and that was 42% of the 2.4 billion without improved sanitation. If we assume the same percentage of the 1 billion population increase, then we're talking about 1.4 billion people to be removed from open defecation and moved to a fixed place defecation, and in fact safely managed sanitation. And that works out at just over 250,000 people per day. And the world managed between 1990 and 2015, 30,000 people per day were removed from open defecation. So again, it's a step change, an order of magnitude, really. So is that feasible? Hygiene is part of the SDG target 6.2, not mentioned before in the MDGs, but the JMP defines hygiene as being hand washing with soap, menstrual hygiene, and food hygiene. Of course, food hygiene is an absolutely enormous subject. And what does that mean in relation to the WASH sector? The United Nations General Assembly passed a resolution in December of last year, so that's in addition to the one in September, which adopted the SDGs. The one in December was basically promulgating sanitation as a human right on its own, so separate from water, the human right to water. And it defined what sanitation was, and it included in that definition the term affordable. So that really has to be part of 6.2, so it's adequate, equitable, and affordable sanitation for all. For all means actually for everybody. So it means children at school, people in hospital, people visiting healthcare centres. Significant numbers of schools don't have water and sanitation facilities. Significant number of healthcare facilities don't have water and sanitation, which will be a surprise to many of us. I can't really imagine hospitals, small hospitals, working without adequate water and sanitation. But it also includes, the disabled, the elderly, prisoners, refugees, nomads. Everybody you think of has to be included in for all. So I think the aims of the SDGs are very, very lofty, and you can say they're admirable, it's something we should be doing. Whether we can do them by 2030, I think is highly in doubt. I think the numbers are just too big. I don't think we can step up from 200,000 people a day with improved sanitation to 600,000 people per day with safely managed sanitation. I don't think that we should not attempt these goals. I think we have to. I think the role of WASH is so important in preventing death, particularly deaths of children under the age of 5, and particularly neonatal deaths. A vast number of children, I'm trying to remember the figure, I think it's something like 300,000 or 350,000 children die in the first 28 days of life due to neonatal sepsis and other neonatal infections, simply because there is no water in sanitation. So there's this huge fecal contamination of the environment. Open defecation leads to huge fecal contamination of the environment, and that's one of the major causes of stunting. And stunting is very serious. It affects approximately a quarter of children under the age of 5, and it doesn't only mean short height for age. It's a main indicator of malnutrition or undernutrition, but it also has huge effects on cognitive development, and stunted children, when they're adults, have much lower productivity. So exactly the opposite what you need for socioeconomic development. So we really have to address that. And open defecation is really important, eliminating it, ending it. And I think my own view is that governments and the multi and bilateral agencies should concentrate on that first before increasing or providing other people, their other citizens who have unimproved sanitation at the moment, with safely managed sanitation. I think really it's much better to concentrate on ending open defecation first.
Okay, thank you very much, Duncan. So if you just pop that down on the table. So quite startling numbers, and perhaps a call to be very focused at the end there. Now, Stuart, I think you might perhaps take a slightly different view of what we need to do in order to secure overall water services, I'm thinking.
Thank you, Barbara. I'm feeling very challenged here at the moment, having to do a debate sitting down. It's almost as big as the topic. But our opponents here are arguing that achieving the WASH targets is going to be a very hard task, nigh on impossible. And they take the view, I suspect, that having other targets in the water SDG are going to be a distraction to that we should keep our focus firmly on the taps and toilets and forget where the water comes from, ignore the things that affect its quality, the way it's governed, and all the other essential services that water provides. It's like we're being asked to sit for a really important exam, and our opponents would like to argue to you, or they go up to the teacher and argue that we should only have to answer questions 1 and 2. 3 to 6 are really, really too hard to do. And by the way, we didn't bother to study them because of that as well. So that argument almost prevailed in the establishment of the SDGs. The WASH focus was really quite evident right through the drafting of the SDGs, right up until mid-2014. And fortunately, there was a strong argument made that A, there needed to be a dedicated water goal, and that this was much more than drinking water and sanitation. Now, as Duncan's reminded us, there's no question that achieving the water SDG and all of its targets is going to be a very difficult challenge. And we may well fail to find all the answers to that, but we certainly have to try. Focusing on the WASH targets alone won't give us the sustainable water future that we want. And perhaps more importantly, I would argue that ignoring the other targets will prevent us from even attaining those, and for that matter, several other of the SDGs. We certainly can't guarantee universal and equitable access to safe and affordable drinking water if we don't address water pollution. We know that by the 1990s, amount of per capita water available for fresh water in developing countries in Asia had already declined by about 60%, largely from water pollution, and it's declined substantially since then. We know that more than half of China's rivers are now too polluted to serve as sources of drinking water. 80% of the water from their underground wells used by farms, factories, households is unfit for drinking because of contamination from industry and farming. China has set very ambitious targets to address that. Their Water 10 plan aims to have more than 70% of water in 7 key rivers and more than 90% of urban drinking water sources above grade 3 or above by 2020. And grade 3 is a fairly high standard by Chinese by their river water quality goals. Interestingly, and I think this is one of the key things the Chinese government expects, is a very positive economic return for that. They expect that the new plan will boost GDP by around 5.7 trillion RMB and result in 1.9 trillion of new investment in environmental protection related industries. So they see that fixing these problems is going to assist them in improving their GDP. Even in a city like this one, in Brisbane, we understand the costs of poor water quality. And in 2013, some of you would have already been reminded, we had a flooding in our upper catchment which overwhelmed the water treatment plant. This city was within 6 hours of running out of drinking water in the middle of a flood. The costs of dealing with poor water quality on average run to about $7 million of extra treatment costs just because of poor catchment management, and that's likely to increase to well over $30 million a year if it's not addressed. So these are not just important issues for the developing world, they're important for developed countries like ours where these result in real increased costs. The second thing we're not going to be able to do is we won't be able to guarantee universal and equitable access to safe and affordable drinking water without increasing and improving water use efficiency. And we certainly aren't going to be able to achieve Goal 2, to end hunger and achieve food security, if we don't do this across the agricultural sector. Agriculture remains the biggest consumer of water, but clearly this is changing in many parts of the world as our populations become increasingly urbanised. And meeting this shift in demand is going to only be possible if we increase efficiency. About 70% of the irrigation in China doesn't apply any kind of water-saving measure, and about half the water supplied to farms through canals and so on is lost along the way. I read recently that if Chinese farmers could grow grain as efficiently as their Israeli counterparts, it would save about 250 billion cubic metres of water a year. And now, for the Australians, that's about 500 Sydney harbours per year, but it's also 5 times the volume of water they're proposing to divert through 3 canals in their controversial south to north water diversion project. Improving water use efficiency in urban areas is also important, and again, the millennium drought here in Australia taught us what's achievable. Brisbane dropped its per capita water consumption to a third of what it was, well below a third of what it was prior to the drought, well below 120 litres a person a day, and I know that sounds like a lot, but long after the drought, this figure still remains at less than half of what it was before the drought. And finally, we won't be able to protect and restore water-related ecosystems, target 6.6, unless we tackle pollution and improve water use efficiency. And many of you in the room are probably asking, well, why would we need to bother about that? Well, I'm a biologist, and of course that's a great concern to me. But it's worth noting that freshwater systems make up less than 1% of the surface area of our planet, but account for about 10% of all animal species, about 1/3 of all the species with backbones, and about 40% of the world's fish species. And many of those fish species, of course, are ones that sustain artisanal fisheries and sources of food and income in many communities. Our focus on end-of-pipe solutions to water management, largely through safe supply and sanitation, has greatly reduced the threat to human security in the developed world, but it's done very little to address the threats to aquatic ecosystems, and in many cases it's made that problem worse. If we continue to focus on this narrow approach, that's going to be a very expensive path for the developing world and a complete disaster for the natural environment. Now, you could argue that that particular target belongs in Goal 15, which was about protecting, restoring, promoting sustainable use of terrestrial ecosystems. And again, interesting to note, until a very late stage in the drafting, that particular goal didn't include freshwater at all. Wetlands and rivers and streams were only added as part of the terrestrial goal very late in the drafting of those documents. So we were going to have a water goal that didn't mention freshwater systems, and we were going to have a terrestrial goal that made no mention of freshwater as well. But regardless of whether the target sits in Goal 15 or Goal 6, we still have a major imperative to meet it. Keeping it in the water goal reminds us of all those important interlinkages we have between this and other targets. I think it's also important to have in the water goal to recognise all the important services that those freshwater systems provide. I mean, you can think of examples in the developing world. For example, in the city of Kampala in Uganda, one of their main wetlands purifies wastewater, removes nutrient loading entering Lake Victoria, and that service saves the Ugandan government somewhere between 1 and 1.7 million in reduced wastewater treatment costs, a much cheaper alternative to other infrastructure options and options that they don't have the funds for anyway. Similarly, in developed countries, in Brisbane, for example, urban water utilities here and across Australia are looking for ways to offset nutrient reduction and energy reduction through restoration of degraded land as a cheaper option to these expensive infrastructure upgrades.
Can I ask you to wrap up, Stuart?
Yeah. So we know the SDG is an important challenge for society, no question about it. But it's not good enough to throw your hands up in the air and say it's all too hard. And because of that, we should only focus on part of the problem. I think setting ambitious targets that cover all aspects of the water management challenge is really important to get governments and society to understand their interdependencies. And if we have aspirations for a sustainable water future, we need to do more than just WASH. And I think the new Water SDG provides that opportunity. So thanks.
Thanks very much, Stuart. So, Ian, now that may all sound very compelling, but I know that you worry a lot about what we're actually doing just at the TAPS end of the equation and how difficult it is to give people water services that really work, and particularly how hard it is to find out what's going on at that level. So would you like to say a little bit about that?
Sure, thank you, Barbara. I'm going to pick up on what Duncan's been saying and take it down to the country level with a few examples. And also to pick up on Stuart's analogy, it's also like you're going to an exam and not only you don't want to answer those last questions, but also questions 1 and 2, the marking scheme has been significantly tightened since you did your revision. So I've got 3 points here. The first, I'm mainly going to be talking about rural water here to really focus. I've got 3 points. The first one is if we take this strong definition of universal access, which is reflected in the JMP's green paper, which I strongly recommend you read, by the way, which includes things like available when needed and at-home supplies, it's going to be pretty tricky to meet that based on what we have now. The second point is that we know that people in many developing countries use more than one water point. They rely on multiple water points for different users. And so if their primary water point goes out of service, they need a fallback option. And the third point is that if we take the kind of MDG definition of improved, which is now called basic access under the new framework, then we're going to overstate access. But if we take the safely managed definition, which is in the new framework, then it's unachievable. So we're kind of screwed either way. So, right, point 1. So universal, meaning at all times or available when needed. I'm sure you've all seen the statistics on functionality of water points, you know, the RWSN data from Africa, you know, a third of water points not working, etc. We did some research on this kind of thing in the last 2 years, a project called VFM WASH, and the website for that's on the handout, which you've got. So that involves household surveys in 4 countries, which are again on the handout. Household surveys which are nationally representative. So I've got some data to try and illustrate these points. So if you look at the left-hand graph at the bottom of the page, this on the y-axis you've got the proportion of households in our sample. I'd just like to draw your attention to Ethiopia, the third bar along, and basically the coloured bars, the orange and yellow ones, are the households in which people use more than one water point on a daily basis. And you can see in Ethiopia it's about 72% of households, which is very high. And that's brilliant because it means that if your primary water point does go out of service, you have some kind of backup. I should also emphasise this is both improved and unimproved water points. If you look at Mozambique, however, the fourth column, then you've only got 10% of households who are using more than one water point on a daily basis, which makes them a lot more vulnerable. The second point I'd like to make refers to figure 2, the right-hand one, and this is for Ethiopia only, and it's the water points which people have used in the last month, not on a daily basis. And just in the red boxes, you can see that this is the proportion of people who've used at least 2 water points in the last month at any distance, and then you look what happens if you introduce a restriction of that, have those water points both having to be within 30 minutes round trip. And you can see that the drop-off there, it goes from 77 down to 31 after you introduce that restriction. So again, you've kind of got, if your main water point does go out of service, and then that means that you're going to use your second choice one, and your level of service will go down because you'll have to walk a lot further. So last point, is that the basic, if we take the kind of MDG style definition of improved, which is now called basic, then you're going to overstate access for a couple of reasons. The main reason is, the monitoring and the demographic health survey and the mixed surveys that form the basis of these estimates are cross-sectional, so you're just taking a snapshot view. So this misses the experience over time. It misses what people do when things break and what happens in different seasons. Secondly, it misses the fact that the fallback option is never as good. When your main water point's out of service, you use your second one, it's never as good a level of service. But then if we take, the kind of stronger definition of that's in the SDGs, safely managed, which includes, at-home supplies, which includes available when needed, i.e. all the time almost, then it becomes unachievable because so many households, as Duncan set out, don't have that level of service now. So in conclusion, the SDGs are going to be difficult to do. They're also going to be difficult to monitor. And it's not looking great for this exam.
Oh, it's always good to have some cheerful British people in the room, isn't it? Thank you, Ian. Now, Louise, you're going to introduce a final dimension of complexity to all of this, which is the climate, but in a positive way. So
that's what Aussies
take
are like,
note,
right?
you British people.
Yeah, thank you, Barbara. So I'm going to talk specifically on how actually embedding WASH into WRM processes can be a benefit, and the SDG provides an opportunity to do that. So I think the very idea that we can pursue WASH targets, although to be fair, you haven't exactly said this, but to pursue WASH targets and then do a WRM later or to do it sequentially is the kind of old school business as usual thinking that's got us into this situation, this quite frightening situation that Don Blackmore, I think, outlined this morning and put the fear of God into us all. And the distinction between the environment or the green or the water resource agenda and then the human and development agenda is just, it's a real false dichotomy in my view, and does stand in the way of universal access. So we've heard it all today, but just to quickly touch on it, all aquifers are declining, 80% of wastewater is discharged untreated. We've got cities that are sinking. I think Mexico is sinking by about 12 centimetres a year, compacting the groundwater. That's storage that is being lost forever. And then, worryingly, but also positively, you go to countries like, for example, Ethiopia, their poverty eradication agenda rests on irrigation. And so the GTP in Ethiopia relies on a 6-fold increase in irrigation. That's a huge amount of water withdrawals, but they're not doing any analysis of their water resource. So that is quite worrying, and I'm trying to argue that it's worrying for WASH people. I think Katarina is right when she said this morning that a lot of people do not have access, not for physical scarcity reasons, but for socio-economic, political reasons. But I'm arguing that some of these trends are really going to exacerbate what people and even extend the amount of WASH poverty we're seeing. So as a sector, if we want to have water that is of sufficient quality, that is of sufficient quantity, and it is reliable, I think we need to start to get more involved in water resources management. Now, how do we do that? We have to, I think, be quite honest about why water resource management has failed. So IWRM, Integrated Water Resource Management, has been applied in a very formulaic way in many countries and very top-down. And I think the reality is in many of these countries with highly informal water economies, it's going to be really hard to get that sort of collaborative use of water at the very top level. So we have to start at the bottom, and there are many communities that are not touched by water policy or water law. So how do we work with them to get them to manage their own water resources in the interim? And we've seen at WaterAid that communities are all too happy to get involved in watershed management to start to look beyond their taps and toilets if they see benefits and real increases in their lives. I think a real pinch point is going to be in and around large urban centres that are growing very fast. They're not growing in a managed way. And what we really need to see there is WASH people, so mayors and utilities, getting more involved and understanding where their water is coming from, talking to the water resource managers. And making sure that WASH, because water for WASH does need to be prioritised over all other uses, but if water resources are badly managed, there's just no way that that can be enforced. And finally, I was asked to talk about climate change. Yes, it's very scary. Climate change is water change. I think it's mostly just going to exacerbate a lot of the threats that we see today. But I try and pitch it as an opportunity. So when you talk to decision makers, you see that automatically when they think about climate change, they're thinking of long term. they're thinking sustainability, and I think if we all work together, we can push at them thinking about the sort of government systems that are needed to reduce risk and increase climate resilience. And then, of course, we have climate financing to help back that up. So I think if we try and look at climate finance as an opportunity to drive the paradigm shift or the transformational change in the way that we're managing things, we can have a chance of reaching universal access by 2030.
Thank you very much. Okay, I'm going to... These optimists get a lot more clapping than you guys. I'm going to ask you all to be thinking about questions, and if you do have a question, if you could just stand up and come down to stand at the mic, maybe 2 or 3 people can stand in a queue. But while you're thinking about that, and maybe a couple of people are getting ready to stand up, or in fact standing up and going to the mics, I'm just going to ask Duncan, just on this last point, the extent to which, in your experience, these international targets really can be used to galvanise action, or do you see them sometimes as something that seems so unachievable that it's almost an excuse for inaction? How do you see that playing out when you look back on your many years of experience?
Okay, well...
You need your mic, sorry.
Okay, in the 1980s we had the International Drinking Water Supply and Sanitation Decade, water and sanitation for all by the end of 1990. Then we had Safe Water 2000, which did include sanitation, the same target by the end of 2000. We then had the MDGs, which weren't water and sanitation for everybody, but as you know, to reduce by half the proportion of people without improved water and sanitation, using 1990 as the baseline. And now we're back on track with water and sanitation for everybody, now by 2030. There's no doubt that the decades and the MDG period did galvanize action. I think certainly the 1980s, because that was the first one, I think it sort of tapered off a bit in the 1990s. But you can argue on many counts, although the sanitation target wasn't met, many other targets also were not met, but the progress was quite extraordinarily good. Fantastic achievements. I've heard it argued that the MDGs were successful because there were not so many goals and not so many targets. Now we have 17 goals and 169 targets. And I've heard it said, if you have 169 targets, you might as well not have any. Because it's too confusing, actually. I agree about what was said about water pollution. I think that's really very important. And I think it's absolute disgrace, really, that people who are sewered don't have wastewater treatment. 80% of wastewater from sewered communities is untreated. Why is this? I don't believe it's a lack of money. I think it's a lack of political will. I think for any large organization wanting to borrow money for good wastewater treatment can borrow that money quite easily. As indeed you can borrow money for water supply and sanitation projects, provided they're well prepared. And you can even get money to prepare the projects. So I think these international targets do galvanize action. I'm sure that the world will be rejuvenated by the SDGs from the MDGs. And although I don't think we will be successful in meeting many of these 169 targets, but at least we'll have a damn good try.
Good. Thank you very much, Duncan. I'm actually going to open the floor, with apologies to Stuart and his team. I can see 3 questions. So do you want to all step up, ask you a question? I'm going to start over there. Can you just tell us who you are, Bruce, from WHO?
So I'm Bruce from WHO. No, I mean, this has been a really interesting discussion, and it sort of had me thinking a little bit about, I think, what Julianne said this morning when she welcomed us. And she mentioned, I think, quite strongly that the SDGs have a universal agenda. In other words, they need to be applicable across the board. And then we start getting into sort of the conundrum that Stuart has, or that Ian's been raising about, whether it's achievable. But you have a basic or unimproved, kind of ambition or possibilities in many countries, which may be of no interest in other countries. So that puts us in this really interesting position of, are we looking at this through the global lens, without kind of adapting it to country context, 169 indicators and all sorts of goals? Is that the right conversation sort of to be having? And it would be interesting to kind of sort of take this apart and think, how are countries, it seems to me that my, sort of, what I would take from this discussion is countries darn well better adapt these, to their national context in terms of their targets and policies. So I don't know if that was a question. It wasn't a question, it was a comment, but it may be just something to reflect on.
Well, we encourage comment. We are actually very interested in the opinion of participants at the conference, you might be surprised to know. Over here on the right.
Yes, I'm Joep, working for Water Sanitation Program for the World Bank. Looking at the title, I was a bit surprised, because I think it should set a strong statement. We are committed to the SDGs. If you look at India, which has set a very, very strong target on sanitation, make the country ODF by 2019. Initially, nobody believed it could be done. We had a secretary who felt, okay, let's try. Now we have a secretary who is committed to make it work in 2 years. And what's happening is actually incredible. And I think what we need to say is that we're going to do the same incredible thing across the world, across 169 targets. Because if we, as people committed to these targets, start asking questions whether it can be done, then I think we're never going to get there. So my question to the panel members is, how do we get there? And how do we give this message that it can be done?
Excellent. I would just like to point out that that's not a question we can answer in 15 minutes, but it's a very good question. I'll take a couple more points and then we'll see what the panel have to say.
I'm Katarina and from SWA. And in the line, I forgot your name, the last gentleman who spoke.
Yep.
Good.
I don't know if I said it right.
I have to say it's not very kind what I'm saying, because I was invited to be a speaker this morning and now here I come and I start criticizing the meeting. But I also don't like the question. I don't like the question because we shouldn't be asking ourselves these philosophical questions right now. We should, as Joep was saying, roll up our sleeves and do the business. And this nostalgic view of the MDGs that were short and whatever, I'm sorry, with all due respect, it doesn't convince me. Because for me, the MDGs had, of course, good things about them, but they were a kind of a paracetamol that we all took not to feel the pain. And they didn't let us look at the real problems and the real issues. We reduced by 50% and we are all happy and feel that we are heroes because we reached them. No, we reached something, yes, but we didn't do everything we needed to do. So I think that the SDGs are a reality check. They are, because they show us the true problems when it comes to water, not only WASH, the bigger picture, and they are much more demanding, yes. Everybody has to have access, it has to be of safety, around the clock, not affordable, accessible, etc. So asking if it is achievable or an opportunity, I think what we have to think, in my humble opinion, is the following. There were 193 UN member states approving it on the 25th of September. It means that 193 states were of the opinion that this is needed and that this is achievable. Otherwise, they wouldn't have, either they are in bad faith, which I don't believe, or they didn't understand what they are signing up to, which I also don't believe. So this means that they want it to happen. So what is the role of everyone, I think, in this room and outside this room? It's A, to support them in doing it, and B, and this is the question to the panel, in making sure that there is also some pressure from civil society organizations, academic organizations, to ask them, so why aren't you making the progress that is needed? So what can we do to create this bigger pressure to make sure that the change happens? Thank you.
I'll take two more points. If I could ask you to be slightly brief, apologies. Oh, and that needs to be tipped over, I think. Can you reach? Okay.
Sure.
Yeah.
Smita Mishra from the World Bank. Excellent debate. And I think in the light of exactly the two comments before me, I'd like to ask one question. Given the strong linkages with the water resource management, and given the strong linkages with agriculture, and the fact that SDG number 2 goal plays such an important role, how do we make the WRM and agriculture be part of the WASH family, and how do we make WASH a part of the agriculture and the WRM family? Because I think we need to debate those points to stop working on a silo basis, but actually to expand the family and to welcome the additions so that we can achieve the SDGs. So let's start tackling the more difficult questions. And then my question to you really is, shouldn't we be adopting a more programmatic approach rather than doing silo projects or silo programs or silo empirics, moving forward in terms of cross-sectoral linkages and getting more empirics, giving the views of the bigger WASH program, including WRM and agriculture. Thanks.
Thank you. I'm only going to take one more point at the moment, just in case. Sorry, Robert, I'm not trying to make you stand there.
Thank you.
Take one more for now. Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you, Barbara. I'm Antonella from the World Youth Parliament for Water. And in this very optimistic future that the world has, I'm thinking of young people, and I'm thinking that the water sector in general does not have an intergenerational knowledge transfer strategy. And so my question to the panel, that many of you come from universities, is what should we be doing differently, or what else can young people do to be included in decision making in the water sector?
Thank you. No, that's a great question. Okay, so panel, I'm not going to ask you all to answer all those questions because we would be here until tomorrow. So I just want to ask, I'll start with Ian, and I want to just ask you this question about national level action, and particularly national level data and the use of data and information at the national level, and what you see maybe happening in that arena that could help us unlock action.
Okay. How do I link that to what people asked? Okay, so I mean, the national level question with respect to, with Bruce's point and the other point that was made about, different countries, this is relevant to all countries. So, we've got this idea that the MDGs were only for developing countries, but now the SDGs are for everybody. And that's why we have this kind of stricter marking scheme, if you like, with safely managed, which is unachievable for the poorest countries, but should be achievable for middle-income countries and above. So you've kind of, the national level, there'll be different levels of kind of ambition which are appropriate, even if the overall ambition is everybody to have safely managed. The other thing that I'd say is that, the monitoring framework that we have now for the SDGs is a lot tighter than what we had for the MDGs. So, we have these different service levels which are very tightly defined, which leave lots of room for different kinds of countries to be included in that. And so, for national level monitoring, if what happens with the MDGs also happens now, and the new rounds of surveys which come out, and the new rounds of institutional monitoring which governments set up, follow this framework, then, in 10 years we'll actually have some hopefully quite good data that will enable us to make decisions about prioritization of finance and so on. So, so in conclusion, I mean, I think that the framework, it is kind of, my optimism here is that we have a really good framework which has been debated in these working groups for the last 4 years, and now we should go out and see what that means for our national level monitoring and try and fix that so that by the time we get to 2030 we actually know what the progress has been.
Great, thank you. Stuart, you work in a university, although I know you also do other things. So I want you just to, I don't know if you can think a little bit about, we're thinking about the experience in Australia, for example. I mean, how realistic is it, or how can we go about folding in a whole new generation of people who care passionately about these subjects, who can make a change? How do you see that happening?
Well, I think one of the arguments we've made is that our past approach to dealing with some of these problems clearly hasn't worked. And, I almost thought when that question was raised is that, the intergenerational knowledge, it's probably a good thing that we're not passing too much of it on, because the new people may come up, the younger people will come up with perhaps some bolder ways of doing it. How we bring these things together and start looking at this challenge in a more holistic way, and to answer that, the question around how do you get the WASH community and the broader integrated water management community together, is I think one of the key steps was to have a combined water goal with all of those targets embedded in it. I think that sends a clear message to governments and society that these things are interconnected and there are interdependencies, and not only interdependencies with these, with a whole range of other goals as well. So I think that, even having a comprehensive water goal, I think, is a major achievement and sets the tone of the next generation's discussion. I mean, I get a sense that people are hung up about the fact it's all going to be too hard to measure and monitor, that there are way too many indicators. I mean, we have dozens of indicators to see how the stock market's performing. 170 indicators for things like food, poverty, water, sanitation, you name it. I mean, God, it's a trivial task.
Oh, it's like music to my ears. It's fantastic. I'm just going to start with Louise, actually, and just this question of getting out of our silos. If you think about an organisation like WaterAid, for example, and your partners, are we going to be able to do that?
Yeah, well, WaterAid are. Definitely, and no, but across all of our almost 40 countries, there's this huge growing interest in water security and water resources management. And it's not because I'm a great internal advocate, it's because of what the countries are seeing out there on the ground. So this need for I think the WASH sector has a responsibility to look up the pipe and down the drain more, But also we have to start to think more about how water resources are managed. And I often hear this, statistic that WASH water is only 9% of the use, so it's not really our concern. But I just think, firstly, that's not true in many cases, especially in around big cities, and it's just not going to be good enough anymore. And we have to, I think where civil society can play a role is to start to build that awareness that these things affect us. And I would agree with Katerina and others that the technical solutions are often there. Like Australia, Murray-Darling Basin, extremely water scarce, but we know and we've set up the institutions and people don't die when we have a drought here. So of course, a lot of that is not applicable to developing countries, but what can we take and what role can civil society take in making those, that knowledge known and then making sure the money is going to where it is needed most.
Okay. And Duncan, you told us it was a very, very big challenge, but if you could give a piece of advice to the people in this room who are most of them going back to country processes to really try and, if we're going to make this step change, what would you say to people?
Well, on the sanitation side, on the sanitation side, I think it's quite clear. We have to do our best to provide everybody with safely managed sanitation by 2030. There is one particular problem which the current definitions of WHO UNICEF Joint Monitoring Programme actually make this task impossible, and that is the exclusion of safely managed shared sanitation in urban slums. There are something like 880 million people living in slums in urban areas. That was the figure for the year before last. And there is physically not space in these slums for individual household level sanitation facilities. Mm-hmm. Now, in 2014, in one of the JMP papers, in 2013 actually, and 2014, shared sanitation was permitted with fairly reasonable restrictions. But in the SDGs, it's been obliterated. And what we have to do, we can't just say, well, what are we going to do about urban slums? There are some solutions, and probably the best solution, although it's quite difficult to conceive at the moment, is to have well-managed shared sanitation. So you can call them communal latrines or community-based latrines, whatever. And we all know that at the moment, most of these are in a terrible state, complete fecal disorder. But there is no reason why you can't have safely managed sanitation. I mean, there are some examples. I can think of some very good examples in Kenya, in one of the largest slums there, where there is very good, safely managed sanitation, communal sanitation blocks. Actually, they're communal water and sanitation blocks. And there need to be many, many more of these. And I think that in itself, it would be a very good SDG, safely managed sanitation target.
Excellent, thank you. So, I mean, just to flip it slightly and say that there are things that can be done. Perhaps what we're hearing from the floor is that we have to stop worrying about whether we should do it and get on with doing it. So I'm just going to give each side one last intervention, sentence or two. Ian and Duncan. Ian?
Okay.
Something inspiring, I think, is what they're looking for before they
yeah,
post the
something
break.
Inspiring. I'm not
Okay,
sure I can do that very
I'll leave
easily.
Ian to... Come on.
Okay, well, something inspiring is that as long as each country can adapt the targets to their own situation and make things which are ambitious yet achievable for their country, then that's something that everybody in that country can align behind. So I think my message is it's about national processes, national monitoring, and national decision making.
Excellent, thank you. And on this side?
I guess the other thing, these are goals for not just for countries too. These are goals for industry and mining companies and so on. And many of those multinational companies are already positioning their businesses to see how well they're performing to these goals. So this is not just about governments in countries trying to achieve the goals.
Excellent, thank you. Okay, so I'm just going to ask you by show of hands. I'm going to stand up because the lights are really tricky to see. So, how optimistic are you all feeling? So before you tell me, I want you all to close your eyes when I say, and then if you're really optimistic, I want you to put both hands up in the air. And if you're not optimistic at all, you just keep your hands down. But close your eyes first of all. So close your eyes. Do you think that the SDGs give us cause for optimism in the water sector? Go. Oh, that's pretty good. So some half optimists. You can have a look around. Keep your hands up. Open your eyes and have a look around. Yeah, there's some half optimists. There's a lot of very optimistic people in this room. That's very exciting. Okay, thank you very much. I'd like to really thank our panelists. It's extremely difficult to do this debating because I think we all know that these are very complex questions without simple answers. And it's very, very generous of my colleagues to put themselves in the position of trying to sort of put themselves on one side or the other of the debate. So I'd like to ask you all to join with me in thanking our excellent panel.